Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 159 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I've got an article to share with you by Ludwig von Mises. It's actually an essay out of a book called Planning for Freedom. And for those of you who don't know, maybe I should do an episode separately about who Ludwig von Mises is. But he's a key figure in the school of Austrian economics. And Ludwig von Mises was very influential on me. For those who don't know, I'll just tell a quick story. In high school, and actually starting way earlier, all I really cared to do after my secondary education, after high school, was to go into the military. And specifically, I wanted to become an Army Ranger. I remember reading I think it was 7th grade, maybe even 6th grade, an article out of Sports Illustrated about Ranger School. And from the time that I'd read that article and about the challenge that it posed, the sort of character, the drive, the desire that it took to become an Army Ranger, and the camaraderie that comes with it, that's all that I wanted to do. And I decided in high school that I would apply to the United States Military Academy at West Point. And while I was on an official visit there, I was staying at a hotel with my parents, and the famous exchange between Ron Paul and Rudy Giuliani took place during the presidential debate cycle. And Ron Paul brought up this concept of blowback, and the idea was that 9/11 and other terrorist attacks didn't just happen in a vacuum, and the terrorists don't really hate America because of its freedom. They hate us because of our intervention abroad, because that we've been intervening in their lives in the Middle East for years and years by sending troops, by bombing certain regions, and trying to influence, trying to impose our way of life on them. And it was the first time, and it seems silly now, but it was the first time that I'd heard that position articulated. And it changed. It's not an exaggeration to say that hearing that changed the course of my life dramatically. I decided not to go to West Point for other reasons as well, but largely, I would say mostly because of that, because I had doubts about what we were being told by the foreign policy establishment, by the military-industrial complex. I had doubts about our mission in the Middle East, and I didn't feel like I could give my life to a mission that I didn't believe in. Of course, I believe in protecting and defending the United States, but I didn't believe that what we were doing abroad was helping accomplish that. In fact, I thought that it was undermining that interest to a significant degree. And Ron Paul, after hearing him say that, I became introduced by another friend of mine, actually a former guest on the podcast, Aaron Sperling. He was on one of the early episodes about Stoicism. He gave me a book by Ludwig von Mises called Human Action, which is a massive book about philosophy and economics primarily, but also about sort of what motivates human action, what motivates people to act, to interact, and how to most effectively, view the field of economics in terms of human desire, human nature, I should say. And that book further changed my worldview and how I not only viewed foreign policy, but all sorts of government intervention, and it sent me down the road even further toward advocating for freedom, for voluntary interaction, and for human liberty. So, needless to say, Ludwig von Mises was very influential on me in his book Human Action. Now, Human Action, like I said, is a massive book. It's sort of his magnum opus. He also wrote a book, and I actually, one of my research papers in undergrad was related to his book Socialism, which is also an excellent book. But he was a prolific writer, and he's written a number of books and essays. And one of the essays I'm going to share with you today is called Middle of the Road Policy Leads to Socialism. Uh, but before I do that, before I get into this essay, I also want to share a short piece with you. It's actually the newsletter from the Tuttle twins, which is primarily a book series for children, but it's also incredibly useful, I think, for adults, especially adults who went through the government education uh, system, and, or I should say, government indoctrination and miseducation system. Uh, the Tuttle Twins books are an excellent book series. I did an episode with Ken Schooland about his book, the Jonathan Gullible book. I think the Tuttle Twins kind of falls into that same category, and I think is an excellent resource for children and adults who are wanting to get a better understanding about American history, about economics, about the the benefits of voluntary interaction and the downfalls, the pitfalls, the unintended consequences of government intervention. But he says this about Veterans Day, and I thought this was worth sharing. He says, on Veterans Day, we honor the brave men and women who answered the call to serve their country with dedication and sacrifice. It's an important tradition and one worthy of recognition. I don't think that we do our veterans justice when we thank them for their service with a pat on the back or a Facebook post one day a year and then go back to business as usual the other 364. That seems kind of empty. I tend to think that the best way to actually pay tribute to the sacrifice and service of veterans is to work to create a world where fewer young people have to go through the horrors of war in the first place. Politicians and bureaucrats treat war as a tool to flex power, pad their pockets, and move international chess pieces in ways that serve their special interests, all while our sons and daughters and countless millions of innocent people in foreign lands pay the price. Frederick Bastiat warned, when goods do not cross borders, soldiers will. And I believe this to be true. Many religious, political, and regional disagreements can and have been set aside when mutually beneficial trade makes getting along more profitable than going to war. Peace isn't just a nice idea. It's a practical, achievable, even essential policy for any nation that wants to stay prosperous for long. We all know veterans who exemplify courage, selflessness, and loyalty. Those values deserve recognition. We need more people with strength of character. But I'd like to see us raise future generations who can develop those traits without having to get them deployed to foreign lands, fighting for interests that may not be their own. The great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises believed that only reason could conquer war. And where does reason come from? It comes from knowledge. It comes from understanding history and being able to apply its lessons to the things happening right now. It's about making wise observations and then acting on them. This is why learning history is so vital to becoming a free and prosperous future. When we understand the causes and consequences of conflict, we're better equipped to advocate for peace, for solutions that don't unnecessarily put generations of young men and women in harm's way. If we want to build a future where peace, not conflict, is the norm, it's going to have to start with a generation that has a rich understanding of the past and can act to avoid the pitfalls those before them couldn't. Honoring those who serve means more than looking back. It means moving forward with the lessons they've taught us and using them to build a better, more peaceful, and more prosperous future. It's what our kids deserve. Connor Boyack. So, Like I said, that was the Tuttle Twins newsletter from today. I'd highly encourage you to go check out the Tuttle Twins book series and sign up for the newsletter. It's a great newsletter. I think comes out, doesn't flood your inbox too much, and has some great content in it. So definitely go check that out. But the other thing I want to say, obviously, last week was the United States presidential election, and Donald Trump, of course, won the presidential election. I think that's good news for veterans. I think that's good news for peace. At least I hope so. Anyway, I think that Donald Trump's instincts about foreign intervention are better than most candidates for president, and I hope that he does a better job than he did his first term about surrounding himself with people who are also skeptical of intervention abroad. And of course, right after the election, there was already talk about potential uh, agreements to stop the conflict in Ukraine, and some rumblings about what may happen in the Middle East with Israel and the Palestinians. I'm less hopeful or optimistic with respect to Israel because of particularly because of Netanyahu, uh, but I'm hopeful that Trump has a positive influence and moves the world closer toward peace. So with that said, let's get into the article for today. And part of the reason that I'm sharing this article along with a lot of the other articles that I share is that, like I said at the beginning when I started this podcast is about sharing this information with you, the audience, but it's also a way uh, for me, it's for selfish reasons, to hold myself accountable, to force me to reflect on these ideas, to revisit them more often, because I think if we want a free world, a prosperous world, a peaceful world, more people have to become acquainted with these ideas, and not only become acquainted with them, but be able to articulate them, to form the intellectual capacity to spread the ideas, not just to know them yourself. So I think that becoming acquainted with the ideas of Mises, of Ron Paul, of Bastiat, of Thomas Sowell, of Tom Woods is helpful for our intellectual ability and capacity to spread these ideas. And that's for me as well as for you. Remember this show, The Forge of Freedom. It's about forging freedom by working on ourselves and helping to spread these ideas to our community, our loved ones, and hopefully throughout the world. So, with that being said, this article again is called Middle of the Road Policy Leads to Socialism. And this is actually from an address that Ludwig von Mises delivered before the University Club in New York on April 18th, 1950. So it's an old, 74 years old, this the content of this article or this essay, but it's still as relevant today as it was then. So let's get into it here. The fundamental dogma of all brands of socialism and communism is that the market economy, or capitalism, is a system that hurts the vital interests of the immense majority of people for the sole benefit of a small minority of rugged individualists. It condemns the masses to progressing impoverishment. It brings about misery, slavery, oppression, degradation, and exploitation of the working men, while it enriches a class of idle and useless parasites. This doctrine was not the work of Karl Marx. It had been developed long before Marx entered the scene. Its most successful propagators were not the Marxian authors, but such men as Carlyle and Ruskin, the British Fabians, the German professors, and the American institutionalists. And it is a very significant fact that the correctness of this dogma was contested only by few economists who were very soon silenced and barred from access to the universities, the press, the leadership of political parties, and first of all, public office. Public opinion by and large accepted the condemnation of capitalism without any reservation. Socialism. But of course, the practical political conclusions which people drew from this dogma were not uniform. One group declared that there is but one way to wipe out these evils, namely to abolish capitalism entirely. They advocate the substitution of public control of the means of production for private control. They aim at the establishment of what is called socialism, communism, planning, or state capitalism. All these terms signify the same thing. No longer should the consumers, by their buying and abstention from buying, determine what should be produced, in what quantity, and of what quality. Henceforth, a central authority alone should direct all production activities. Number 2, interventionism, allegedly a middle-of-the-road policy. A second group seems to be less radical. They reject socialism no less than capitalism. They recommend a third system which, as they say, is as far from capitalism as it is from socialism, which, as a third system of society's economic organization, stands midway between the two other systems, and while retaining the advantages of both, avoids the disadvantages inherent in each. The third system is known as the system of interventionism. In the terminology of American politics, it is often referred to as the middle-of-the-road policy. What makes this third system popular with many people is the particular way they choose to look upon the problems involved. As they see it, two classes, the capitalists and entrepreneurs on the one hand and the wage earners on the other hand, are arguing about the distribution of the yield of capital and entrepreneurial activities. Both parties are claiming the whole cake for themselves. Now, suggest these mediators, let us make peace by splitting the disputed value equally between the two classes. The state, as an impartial arbiter, should interfere and should curb the greed of the capitalists and assign a part of the profits to the working classes. Thus, it will be possible to dethrone the Moloch capitalism without enthroning the Moloch of totalitarian socialism. Yet this mode of judging the issue is entirely fallacious. The antagonism between capitalism and socialism is not a dispute about the distribution of booty. It is a controversy about which of two schemes for society's economic organization, capitalism or socialism, is conducive to the better attainment of those ends which all people consider as the ultimate aim of activities commonly called economic, viz., the best possible supply of useful commodities and services. Capitalism wants to attain these ends by private enterprise and initiative, subject to the supremacy of the public's buying and abstention from buying on the market. The socialists want to substitute the unique plan of a central authority for the plans of the various individuals. They want to put in place of what Marx called the anarchy of production, the exclusive monopoly of the government. The antagonism does not refer to the mode of distributing a fixed amount of amenities. It refers to the mode of producing all those goods which people want to enjoy. The conflict of the two principles is irreconcilable and does not allow of any compromise. Control is indivisible. Either the consumer's demand as manifested on the market decides for what purposes and how the factors of production should be employed, or the government takes care of these matters. There is nothing that could mitigate the opposition between these two contradictory principles. They preclude each other. Interventionism is not a golden mean between capitalism and socialism. It is the design of a third system of society's economic organization and must be appreciated as such. Number 3, how interventionism works. It is not the task of today's discussion to raise any questions about the merits either of capitalism or socialism. I am dealing today with interventionism alone, and I do not intend to enter into an arbitrary evaluation of interventionism from any preconceived point of view. My only concern is to show how interventionism works and whether or not it can be considered as a pattern of a permanent system of society's economic organization. The interventionists emphasize that they plan to retain private ownership of the means of production, entrepreneurship, and market exchange. But they go on to say it is peremptory to prevent these capitalist institutions from spreading havoc and unfairly exploiting the majority of people. It is the duty of government to restrain, by orders and prohibitions, the greed of the propertied classes, lest their acquisitiveness harms the poorer classes. Unhampered or laissez-faire capitalism is an evil, but in order to eliminate its evils, there is no need to abolish capitalism entirely. It is possible to improve the capitalist system by government interference with the actions of the capitalists and entrepreneurs. Such government regulation and regimentation of business is the only method to keep off totalitarian socialism and to salvage those features of capitalism which are worth preserving. On the ground of this philosophy, the interventionists advocate a galaxy of various measures. Let us pick out one of them, the very popular scheme of price control. Number 4, how price control leads to socialism. The government believes that the price of a definite commodity, e.g., milk, is too high. It wants to make it possible for the poor to give their children more milk. Thus, it results to a price ceiling and fixes the price of milk at a lower rate than that prevailing on the free market. The result is that the marginal producers of milk, those producing at the highest cost, now incur losses. As no individual farmer or businessman can go on producing at a loss, these marginal producers stop producing and selling milk on the market. They will use their cows and their skill for other, more profitable purposes. They will, for example, produce butter, cheese, or meat. There will be less milk available for the consumers, not more. This, of course, is contrary to the intentions of the government. It wanted to make it easier for some people to buy more milk, but as an outcome of its interference, the supply available drops. The measure proves abortive from the very point of view of the government and the groups it was eager to favor. It brings about a state of affairs which, again, from the point of view of the government, is even less desirable than the previous state of affairs which it was designed to improve. Now the government is faced with an alternative. It can abrogate its decree and refrain from any further endeavors to control the price of milk. But if it insists upon its intention to keep the price of milk below the rate the unhampered market would have determined, and wants nonetheless to avoid a drop in the supply of milk, it must try to eliminate the causes that render the marginal producer's business unremunerative. It must add to the first decree concerning only the price of milk a second decree fixing the prices of the factors of production necessary for the production of milk at such a low rate that the marginal producers of milk will no longer suffer losses and will therefore abstain from restricting output. But then the same story repeats itself on a remoter plane. The supply of the factors of production required for the production of milk drops, and again the government is back where it started. If it does not want to admit defeat and to abstain from any meddling with prices, it must push further and fix the prices of those factors of production which are needed for the production of the factors necessary for the production of milk. Thus, the government is forced to go further and further, fixing step by step the prices of all consumers' goods and of all factors of production, both human, i.e., labor and material, and to order every entrepreneur and every worker to continue work at these prices and wages. No branch of industry can be omitted from this all-round fixing of prices and wages, and from this obligation to produce those quantities which the government wants to see produced. If some branches were to be left free out of regard for the fact that they produce only goods qualified as non-vital or even as luxuries, capital and labor would tend to flow into them, and the result would be a drop in the supply of those goods, the prices of which the government has fixed precisely because it considers them as indispensable for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. But when this state of all-round control of business is attained, there can no longer be any question of a market economy. No longer do the citizens by their buying and abstention from buying determine what should be produced and how. The power to decide these matters has devolved upon the government. This is no longer capitalism. It is all-round planning by the government. It is socialism. Number 5, the Zwangswirtschaft type of socialism. It is, of course, true that this type of socialism preserves some of the labels and the outward appearance of capitalism. It maintains seemingly and nominally private ownership of the means of production, prices, wages, interest rates, and profits. In fact, however, nothing counts but the government's unrestricted autocracy. The government tells the entrepreneurs and capitalists what to produce and in what quantity and quality, at what prices to buy and from whom, at what prices to sell and to whom. It decrees at what wages and where the workers must work. Market exchange is but a sham. All the prices, wages, and interest rates are determined by the authority. They are prices, wages, and interest rates in appearance only. In fact, they are merely quantity relations in the government's orders. The government, not the consumers, directs production. The government determines each citizen's income. It assigns to everybody the position in which he has to work. This is socialism in the outward guise of capitalism. It is the Zwangswirtschaft of Hitler's German Reich and the planned economy of Great Britain. Number 6, German and British experience. For the scheme of social transformation which I have depicted is not merely a theoretical construction, it is a realistic portrayal of the succession of events that brought about socialism in Germany, in Great Britain, and in some other countries. The Germans in the First World War began with price ceilings for a small group of consumers' goods considered as vital necessaries. It was the inevitable failure of these measures that impelled them to go further and further until, in the second period of the war, they designed the Hindenburg Plan. In the context of the Hindenburg Plan, no room whatever was left for a free choice on the part of the consumers and for initiative action on the part of business. All economic activities were unconditionally subordinated to the exclusive jurisdiction of the authorities. The total defeat of the Kaiser swept the whole imperial apparatus of administration away, and with it went also the grandiose plan. But when in 1931 the Chancellor Brüning embarked anew on a policy of price control and his successors, first of all Hitler, obstinately clung to it, the same story repeated itself. Great Britain and all the other countries which in the First World War adopted measures of price control had to experience the same failure. They too were pushed further and further in their attempts to make the initial decrees work, but they were still at a rudimentary stage of this development when the victory and the opposition of the public brushed away all schemes for controlling prices. It was different in the Second World War. Then Great Britain again resorted to price ceilings for a few vital commodities and had to run the whole gamut, proceeding further and further until it had substituted all-round planning of the country's whole economy for economic freedom. When the war came to an end, Great Britain was a socialist commonwealth. It is noteworthy to remember that British socialism was not an achievement of Mr. Attlee's Labour government, but of the War Cabinet of Mr. Winston Churchill. What the Labour Party did was not the establishment of socialism in a free country, but retaining socialism as it had developed during the war in the post-war period. The fact has been obscured by the great sensation made about the nationalization of the Bank of England, the coal mines, and other branches of business. However, Great Britain is to be called a socialist country, not because certain enterprises have been formally expropriated or nationalized, but because all the economic activities of all citizens are subject to full control of the government and its agencies. The authorities direct the allocation of capital and of manpower to the various branches of business. They determine what should be produced. Supremacy in all business activities is exclusively vested in the government. The people are reduced to the status of wards, unconditionally bound to obey orders. To the businessmen, the former entrepreneurs, merely ancillary functions are left. All that they are free to do is to carry into effect, within a neatly circumscribed narrow field, the decisions of the government departments. What we have realized is that price ceilings affecting only a few commodities fail to attain the ends sought. On the contrary, they produce effects which, from the point of view of the government, are even worse than the previous state of affairs which the government wanted to alter. If the government, in order to eliminate these inevitable but unwelcome consequences, pursues its course further and further, it finally transforms the system of capitalism and free enterprise into socialism of the Hindenburg pattern. Number 7, crises and unemployment. The same is true of all other types of meddling with the market phenomena. Minimum wage rates, whether decreed and enforced by the government or by labor union pressure and violence, result in mass unemployment prolonged year after year as soon as they try to raise wage rates above the height of the unhampered market. The attempts to lower interest rates by credit expansion generate, it is true, a period of booming business, but the prosperity thus created is only an artificial hothouse product and must inexorably lead to the slump and to the depression. People must pay heavily for the easy money orgy of a few years of credit expansion and inflation. The recurrence of periods of depression and mass unemployment has discredited capitalism in the opinion of injudicious people. Yet these events are not the outcome of the operation of the free market. They are, on the contrary, the result of well-intentioned but ill-advised government interference with the market. There are no means by which the height of wage rates and the general standard of living can be raised, other than by accelerating the increase of capital as compared with population. The only means to raise wage rates permanently for all those seeking jobs and eager to earn wages is to raise the productivity of the industrial effort by increasing the per head quota of capital invested. What makes American wage rates by far exceed the wage rates of Europe and Asia is the fact that American workers' toil and trouble is aided by more and better tools. All that good government can do to improve the material well-being of the people is to establish and preserve an institutional order in which there are no obstacles to the progressing accumulation of new capital required for the improvement of technological methods of production. This is what capitalism did achieve in the past and will achieve in the future too, if not sabotaged by bad policy. Number 8, 2 roads to socialism. Interventionism cannot be considered as an economic system destined to stay. It is a method for the transformation of capitalism into socialism by a series of successive steps. It is, as such, different from the endeavors of the communists to bring about socialism at one stroke. The difference does not refer to the ultimate end of the political movement. It refers mainly to the tactics to be resorted to for the attainment of an end that both groups are aiming at. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels recommended successively each of these 2 ways for the realization of socialism. In 1848, in the Communist Manifesto, they outlined a plan for the step-by-step transformation of capitalism into socialism. The proletariat should be raised to the position of the ruling class and use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie. This, they declare, cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production. By means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. In this vein, they enumerate, by way of example, 10 measures. In later years, Marx and Engels changed their minds. In his main treatise, Das Kapital, first published in 1867, Marx saw things in a different way. Socialism is bound to come with the inexorability of a law of nature, but it cannot appear before capitalism has reached its full maturity. There is but one road to the collapse of capitalism, namely the progressive evolution of capitalism itself. Then only will the great final revolt of the working class give it the finishing stroke and inaugurate the everlasting age of abundance. From the point of view of this latter doctrine, Marx and the school of orthodox Marxism reject all policies that pretend to restrain, to regulate, and to improve capitalism. Such policies, they declare, are not only futile but outright harmful, for they rather delay the coming of age of capitalism, its maturity, and thereby also its collapse. They are therefore not progressive but reactionary. It was this idea that led the German Social Democratic Party to vote against Bismarck's Social Security legislation and to frustrate Bismarck's plan to nationalize the German tobacco industry. From the point of view of the same doctrine, the communists branded the American New Deal as a reactionary plot extremely detrimental to the true interests of the working people. What we must realize is that the antagonism between the interventionists and the communists is a manifestation of the conflict between the two doctrines of the early Marxism and of the late Marxism. It is the conflict between the Marx of 1848 and the author of the Communist Manifesto and the Marx of 1867, the author of Das Kapital. And it is paradoxical indeed that the document in which Marx endorsed the policies of the present-day self-styled anti-communists is called the Communist Manifesto. There are two methods available for the transformation of capitalism into socialism. One is to expropriate all farms, plants, and shops and to operate them by a bureaucratic apparatus as departments of the government. The whole of society, says Lenin, becomes one office and one factory with equal work and equal pay. The whole economy will be organized like the postal system. The second method is the method of the Hindenburg Plan, the originally German pattern of the welfare state and of planning. It forces every firm and every individual to comply strictly with the orders issued by the government's Central Board of Production Management. Such was the intention of the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which the resistance of business frustrated and the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. Such is the idea implied in the endeavors to substitute planning for private enterprise. Number 9, foreign exchange control. The foremost vehicle for the realization of this second type of socialism is in industrial countries like Germany and Great Britain foreign exchange control. These countries cannot feed and clothe their people out of domestic resources. They must import large quantities of food and raw materials. In order to pay for these badly needed imports, they must export manufactures, most of them produced out of imported raw material. In such countries, almost every business transaction, directly or indirectly, is conditioned either by exporting or importing, or by both exporting and importing. Hence, the government's monopoly of buying and selling foreign exchange makes every kind of business activity depend on the discretion of the agency entrusted with foreign exchange control. In this country, matters are different. The volume of foreign trade is rather small when compared with the total volume of the nation's trade. Foreign exchange control would only slightly affect the much greater part of American business. This is the reason why, in the schemes of our planners, there is hardly any question of foreign exchange control. Their pursuits are directed toward the control of prices, wages, and interest rates, toward the control of investment and the limitation of profits and incomes. Number 10, progressive taxation. Looking backward on the evolution of income tax rates from the beginning of the federal income tax in 1913 until the present day, one can hardly expect that the tax will not one day absorb 100% of all surplus above the income of the average voter. It is this that Marx and Engels had in mind when, in the Communist Manifesto, they recommended a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. Another of the suggestions of the Communist Manifesto was abolition of all right of inheritance. Now, neither in Great Britain nor in this country have the laws gone up to this point. But again, looking backward upon the past history of the estate taxes, we have to realize that they more and more have approached the goal set by Marx. Estate taxes of the height they have already attained for the upper brackets are no longer to be qualified as taxes. They are measures of expropriation. The philosophy underlying the system of progressive taxation is that the income and the wealth of the well-to-do classes can be freely tapped. What the advocates of these tax rates fail to realize is that the greater part of the incomes taxed away would not have been consumed, but saved and invested. In fact, this fiscal policy does not only prevent the further accumulation of new capital, it brings about capital decumulation. This is certainly today the state of affairs in Great Britain. Number 11, the trend toward socialism. The course of events in the past 30 years shows a continuous, although sometimes interrupted, progress toward the establishment in this country of socialism of the British and German pattern. The U.S. embarked later than these two other countries upon this decline and is today still farther away from its end. But if the trend of this policy will not change, the final result will only, in accidental and negligible points, differ from what happened in the England of Attlee and in the Germany of Hitler. The middle-of-the-road policy is not an economic system that can last. It is a method for the realization of socialism by installments. Number 12, loopholes capitalism. Many people object. They stress the fact that most of the laws which aim at planning or at expropriation by means of progressive taxation have left some loopholes which offer to private enterprise a margin within which it can go on. That such loopholes still exist and that thanks to them this country is still a free country is certainly true. But this loopholes capitalism is not a lasting system. It is a respite. Powerful forces are at work to close these loopholes. From day to day, the field in which private enterprise is free to operate is narrowed down. 13. The coming of socialism not inevitable. Of course, this outcome is not inevitable. The trend can be reversed, as was the case with many other trends in history. The Marxian dogma, according to which socialism is bound to come, with the inexorability of a law of nature, is just an arbitrary surmise devoid of any proof. But the prestige which this vain prognostic enjoys, not only with the Marxians, but with many self-styled non-Marxians, is the main instrument of the progress of socialism. It spreads defeatism among those who otherwise would gallantly fight the socialist menace. The most powerful ally of Soviet Russia is the doctrine that the wave of the future carries us toward socialism, and that it is therefore progressive to sympathize with all measures that restrict more and more the operation of the market economy. Even in this country, which owes to a century of rugged individualism the highest standard of living ever attained by any nation, public opinion condemns laissez-faire. In the last 50 years, thousands of books have been published to indict capitalism and to advocate radical interventionism, the welfare state, and socialism. The few books which try to explain adequately the work of the free market economy were hardly noticed by the public. Their authors remained obscure, while such authors as Veblen, Commons, John Dewey, and Lasky were exuberantly praised. It is a well-known fact that the legitimate stage as well as the Hollywood industry are no less radically critical of free enterprise than are many novels. There are in this country many periodicals which, in every issue, furiously attack economic freedom. There is hardly any magazine of opinion that would plead for the system that supplied the immense majority of the people with good food and shelter, with cars, refrigerators, radio sets, and other things which the subjects of other countries call luxuries. The impact of this state of affairs is that practically very little is done to preserve the system of private enterprise. There are only middle-of-the-roaders who think they have been successful when they have delayed for some time an especially ruinous measure. They are always in retreat. They put up today with measures which only 10 or 20 years ago they would have considered as undiscussable. They will in a few years acquiesce in other measures which they today consider as simply out of the question. What can prevent the coming of totalitarian socialism is only a thorough change in ideologies. What we need is neither anti-socialism nor anti-communism, but an open, positive endorsement of that system to which we owe all the wealth that distinguishes our age from the comparatively straitened conditions of ages gone by. So there you go. That's an article by Ludwig von Mises. It's chapter 2 of Planning for Freedom. Again, it was called Middle of the Road Policy Leads to Socialism. But I think it's full. Go back and read this again, because some of the language may sound foreign to you if you haven't read this sort of content much previously. But I think it just sheds so much light on so much of the political sort of political pandering that you hear. You think about Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders. I mean, it fits their ideology perfectly, this interventionism, this so-called middle-of-the-road policy, but it's a progressive encroachment and a progressive advancement toward socialism. And frankly, I'm no big fan of Trump. I think that the way he responded in the wake of the assassination attempt was incredibly admirable. I think that in lots of ways he's better than other presidential candidates. But the best thing about him is the talk, and I hope that a lot of it comes true, of reining in the administrative bureaucracy, of the administrative state, because they are sort of the overlords that Mises refers to that inevitably encroach more and more on the free market, because that first measure of price controls doesn't work, so they don't want to give up. They don't want to give up the power, and they don't want to admit defeat. So what do? They go further and further down the road of control. And to exact that control, the government has to implement these administrative agencies to do that. And now we have well over 400 administrative agencies that are controlling nearly everything in our day-to-day lives. And so I think that the election of Trump, I'm hopeful will help rein in those administrative agencies, because frankly, Republican or Democrat, for the last decades has been complicit in this middle-of-the-road approach, this death of freedom by 1,000 cuts, and this road to serfdom, this incremental approach to socialism. So, and this is not a secret. Barack Obama adopted this ideology, this interventionist ideology. Bernie Sanders is very open about this. Hey, I don't want to get rid of capitalism. I want the benefits of capitalism, but I want the government to control it, and I want the government to impose controls on it. He did an interview with Lex Friedman on the popular Lex Friedman podcast, Bernie Sanders did. And he talked about this. So I think that Mises does a great job of parsing out the flaws with this approach, because the government, in all its wisdom, cannot control the economy, cannot control human behavior from the top down. Uh, it's it's the plight of arrogance to believe that as a government official that you can somehow possess the knowledge, wield the knowledge of millions of people and make better decisions than those people can in a decentralized fashion. To have the information that they have when they're out in the world, to make the value judgments that they have when they're out in the world, and to do that from a throne in Washington, D.C., or in the state capitol. So, I hope you got a little something out of this article. I think that, like I said, it sheds so much light on where we are in America. And I like that Mises talks about at the end how this is not an inevitable thing. It requires the ideas of liberty to be understood and to be shared. And that's partly why I do this podcast. And I hope that those who are listening share these ideas with others. And and I think that you see trends. The government has, especially during the COVID era, you saw this. They tried to step in and control every machination of the market, and it had disastrous consequences. Prices out of control, inflation out of control, families falling apart, health falling apart. And I think that is the inevitable result of that fatal conceit that I know better how to live your life than you do. And that's the fatal conceit that nearly every politician has. And we need a renaissance of politicians who say, no, I want to let you live freely. I want to let you act on your own values, on your own judgments, as long as you're not hurting other people. And that's why I'm encouraged by not so much Trump himself, but by the people he's surrounded himself with. I think that they have this sort of intuition. They're not the Republicans of old, like the Mitt Romneys, the John McCains, who want to control you. Just they want to control you in different ways than the Democrats do. So I'm encouraged by the people that Trump has surrounded himself with. Of course, time will tell whether or not a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the promises that he made during his campaign will be carried out. Of course, he came out recently again and doubled down on his promise to abolish the Department of Education. Of course, Mises mentioned here John Dewey in the article. Of course, the Department of Education, the government school system that we have in place today has Prussian socialist roots, and it was meant to condition, to indoctrinate people into being good workers, essentially for the government. So, anyway, with all that being said, please go reread this article, save it, internalize it, share it with others. These are the ideas that help us stop the slow and steady train toward socialism and ultimately the impoverishment of an otherwise wealthy and prosperous world. And I should say, I mentioned Trump. I'm encouraged also by the election of Javier Milei in Argentina. For people who don't know what he's up to down there, you should definitely go look him up. There's been incredible backlash in Argentina because of the government overreach down there. And so I'm hopeful that sort of mindset for freedom can take hold throughout the world and not just in these smaller pockets. So anyway, thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the podcast on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, X, and you can find us at forgeoffreedom.com. The podcast is also available on all the most popular podcast streaming platforms, and I hope you'll tune in next week for episode 160. It's hard to believe that we've got 160 episodes already. All right, everybody, remember, until next time, you are the Forge of Freedom.